In my experience, great multi-day adventures don't just happen, they are carefully planned. Adventures on impulse are seldom successful. My first consideration is who is going on the proposed adventure, and is it within their capabilities. I often go alone to avoid conflict between personalities. I do enjoy good company as well, and unfortunately my regular boating buddy couldn't come this time. I asked my niece Jennifer if she was up for an adventure, and being an outdoor type person, she jumped at the chance. So company was sorted for this one. Next, but probably most important consideration, is a weather forecast for the duration of the journey. It was looking exceptionally good for most of the 4 chosen days at Fionport on the exposed side of the island of Mull, so a route was now considered. Although the winds were gusting to 24 miles per hour on the Wednesday, they were coming out the north, and I would be in the sheltered coast going west along the bottom of Mull. This was a deciding factor that made me choose to go clockwise round the island of Mull instead of anti-clockwise. Once the rough route is decided, I then have to work out places where I can safely moor the boat in the evening and have a spot to pitch a tent. Google Satellite View is often misleading and shows lovely camping spots which on arrival are in fact midge-ridden bogs, totally unsuitable for a tent. I'm fortunate in having local knowledge for most of my trips. Once the route is split into days, it allows me to calculate distances for fuel, etc., and work out tidal flows for the best time to cross difficult sections. I also need to know where I can get fuel and supplies. Going round Mull is easy in that respect, as there are very few places, so I take everything with me for the duration of the entire trip. I carried 110 litres of fuel on board, so to save weight we had to cut back on non-essentials. We took a bottle of whisky instead of a crate of beer. We had a test run at loading the boat before launching it, so we're happy that everything fitted. The bow canopy is essential for me as it keeps everything on board and stops it bouncing overboard. So with the route carefully planned with military precision, the first thing I did before leaving Tidal was to change it. The initial plan was for 5 days at sea, but when I rechecked the forecast, the Sunday was now indicating 30 mile per hour plus gusts, so I replanned for a 4-day adventure. Instead of spending the first night in Loch Buie, I was now going to push on to Balfour's Bay on the Ross of Mull. We launched from Kelly's Pier Tidal on the early morning tide. It was a lovely windless but overcast morning. The outboard started easily and ran very well as we flew down Loch Etive, full of the joys and anticipation of the adventure that lay ahead of us. And soon we were at the first tidal challenge, navigating the Falls of Laura, where Loch Etive empties into the sea. It was of course timed, so the main flow had not yet started, and the heavily laden boat easily traversed the flow. As we approached the Firth of Lorne and the open sea, the island of Mull stood proudly on the horizon above the bow of the boat. I happily followed the coastline of Carrera until I reached Back Island before heading diagonally across to Mull. This route avoids any overfalls which may be coming from the Sound of Mull or Loch Spelvey, where it enters the sea. We enjoyed a smooth crossing on the 4 miles of open water from Back Island to the cliff edge point I was heading for on the island. The stronger gusts of wind were not due until later in the day, and at least now I knew I was in the shelter of the island, so the wind could blow all it wanted as long as it came from the north. It is quite a spectacular coastline from Loch Spelvey to Loch Buie. The vertical cliffs are cut by deep fissures and make interesting photographs. All the time we seem to get higher in height until we top out at maximum elevation near the entrance to Loch Buie. We decided to turn into Loch Buie as we wanted to land for lunch. I landed at the little fisherman's pier, and as we scoffed cake and slurped coffee, I rekindled memories by visiting the hallowed ground I slept on last September, which was the last time I was wild camping here. However, this time we're only passing through, as we intended camping at Balfour's Bay much further along the coast. Refreshed, relaxed, and memories rekindled, we clambered back in the boat and we headed out of Loch Buie. We were surprised and delighted to find that the wind had gone completely. I slowed at Malcolm's Point to let Jennifer see the natural form landmark called the Carsick Arches. And she agreed with me that it really is a lovely area. I didn't hang around her, as I knew it was still a long way to go to get to Balfour's Bay. Not far past Malcolm's Point there is an obvious change in the scenery. The grey and green cliffs start to diminish in height and then disappear altogether, being replaced by pink granite hills, rocks and reefs. Not only that, the sea is more prone to the exposure of mid-Atlantic winds and swells, so it became a little rougher. Until finally we arrived at a beautiful sandy cove called David's Balfour's Bay, and I can think of no place that I would rather be when camping beside the sea. I pitched tent on the grass above the beach, while Jennifer chose the attic room because of its lovely views. We had paradise to ourselves that night, and after something to eat, I walked ashore to explore a little more. Then climbed on high to see what I could spy, until the sun went down, and day one was done. I get my brother Douglas to text weather forecasts to me on a daily basis, so I knew the predictions were changing. The following day should be okay, with winds force 3 to 4, but the next day, Friday, was now showing gusts to force 5. I had to re-evaluate my passage plan once again. I had decided not to venture out to Staffa or Lunga, but keep close to the coast of Mull. There are very strong tides starting just north of Staffa and running between Geometra and the Treshnish Islands, flowing around Treshnish Point and Caolich Point. And although I knew I couldn't avoid them, I wanted to keep out of them as much as possible, even in a benign force 3 wind. I confess to having a sleepless night thinking of the day ahead, as I have quite a lot of experience of strong tidal flows with standing waves, so knew what conditions could be like if the force 5 gusts arrived earlier. The early morning sea har only increased my concern, as it's a long 45-mile journey in a fog. However, after a strong coffee and something to eat, the har cleared from both my brain and the sea, and things looked much brighter as we set off. We went through Tinker's Hole, which is a well-known yacht mooring, and my face drained the colour out the pink granite rocks, leaving them a drab grey colour. Normally, in the past, I would have gone round the Iona rock garden and up the outside coast, but chose the shorter route up the Sound, so that Jennifer could see the Abbey, although it was a very quick glimpse as I wanted to visit the wilderness coast. The wilderness coast is a 6-mile length of impressively high and impregnable cliffs, running from Loch Scridian to Loch Nakeal. They can really only be accessed from boat, as there is no road access on the Ardmenic Peninsula. Many folk that circumnavigate Mull by boat don't even know the scenic area exists, as they bypass it in preference to see Fingal's Cave and the island of Staffa. And I confess I was just as guilty. However, that was about to change as I moved close inshore to see the cliffs. I soon discovered that many underwater reefs don't like me going too close, so I had to stay a reasonable distance away. Unfortunately, the dynamic range of the GoPro camera doesn't pick up the fantastic rock formations and wonderful waterfalls that tumble to the sea. When we passed the 50-million-year-old fossilised tree, I swapped to the Sony camcorder, but it's not in the gimbal, so bounced around a bit. The best way to see the sights is go there and visit them yourselves. Once we reached McKinnon's Cave, which is the longest cave in the Hebrides, I noticed the sea had calmed and sensed the wind dropping. So I made a quick decision to alter my meticulous route plan once again. I turned the bow towards open sea and started to head for Staffa, which was 7 miles offshore. I knew I was taking a chance if the wind arrived again, but going to sea in a small boat is a challenge, and that's what I enjoy. Although we made it to Staffa no problem, instinct and strengthening tides told me that Lunga, which is another 4 miles offshore, was not going to be such an enjoyable challenge. So I turned north and made my way towards Treshnish Point, going between Gometra and the Treshnish Islands. Fortunately, the winds were still light, as it would be wind against tide as well. Normally I would time going round the headlands at slack tide, but I didn't have the luxury this time as I wasn't sure what the wind was going to do. Things starting to brighten as the sun came out, and all the time I resisted the temptation of nipping across the horizon to Lunga. It was closer than Staffa, which was now just a dot in my wake. I could feel the boat getting a little sluggish as it fought against millions of gallons of water flowing past Gometra. But so far so good, and no white water. It wasn't until we got near Treshnish Point that I first saw the tide race several hundred metres away on the seaward side. 6-foot-high waves occasionally burst into the air. I was very glad we were running beside it and not through it. By keeping close inshore, I managed to keep out the main race, but it was still bouncy enough in light winds, and it would have been a real struggle if the winds had been stronger. Crossing Calgary Bay, the race seemed to calm a little, which pleased me as I knew it would reappear again approaching Callac Point, which is the most northwesterly tip of Mull. can be a little tricky navigating the tide races in a small boat. In this instance, I slowed a little to avoid stuffing the bow of the boat into a wave that appeared in front. The boat then struggled to climb over the wave. I immediately heard a loud rushing noise as the following wave broke and tried to come in over the transom of the boat. I breathed a sigh of relief once I cleared Calich Point and left the races behind. The waves in the video were not caused by the wind, as there was very little. They are created by millions of gallons of water flowing round the points. And as such, I do not recommend small boats attempting to go round Mull unless you have experience of tide races. It only takes a second for a boat to fill with water, then possibly be swept into the main race, which is only 50 metres away at points. Add a bit of wind into the mix and things can quickly turn into a disaster. Of course, now I was heading along the north of Mull, the sea was almost like a mill pond in comparison. However, I was looking for a shelter spot to set up camp and stay and land the following day in case the force 5 gusts materialised. I felt that the sandy beach I had initially planned on was a bit exposed, so decided to have a look in a sheltered loch that goes to Derveig. I had not explored this loch before, but Google Earth shows a lovely sheltered sandy bay, ideal to camp in and ride out any storms. However, it proved to be one of these spots which in reality is totally unsuitable. It is the home for a large oyster farm, and the beds are just below the surface when the tide is in. I carefully avoided them and landed for our lunch break. The farm owner did come to check his beds were okay, but gave us a friendly wave when he saw we were fine. So as previously mentioned, do be aware of using Google Satellite to find camping spots, as it can be extremely misleading. The falling tide exposed the full extent of the beds, and we were stranded here until the tide came back in and we could float over them. Not that we were complaining, as it gave us time for a rest and then a leg stretch, and it is a beautiful and sheltered area. Shame about the oyster beds. As soon as the tide allowed enough depth, we were heading off again, still looking for a camp spot for the night. I tried another much shorter sheltered loch, which was guarded by a solitary sea eagle sitting on its stone pedestal. However, the loch proved totally unsuitable as well, but for a different reason. The flat camping area was guarded by big hairy Highland cows, so it was back to sea again, still looking. A pod of bottlenose dolphins passed us on their way to Calich Point, but they showed no interest in us at all and were certainly not going to bow ride. We were now approaching the mouth of the Sound of Mull and not seen anywhere suitable to camp for the day, so I decided to head on to Morvern and camp in Loch Nadromna, which I knew would be very sheltered even in a storm. Skimming across the smooth sunny sea surface, it was hard to believe the following day would have strong winds and rain. We landed at the mouth of a burn and I set up my tent beside the sea, and was delighted when the high tide stopped where it did. Otherwise I may have had a wet dream. We scoffed some supper while slurping some whisky as the sun went down, and another day was done. Before turning in for the night, my brother texted the next day's forecast, and it had changed yet again. The strong winds and rain were now dry but overcast with force 3 to 4 winds. It didn't change my plans for the day, as I was a bit weary, so decided to only explore the islands round Loch Nadromna and Loch Deichas, a distance of around 20 miles, then have a land walk to see the local views. After breakfast we went on a slow tour of Loch Nadromna before heading around Ornsey. It was very overcast, but as the forecast promised, it didn't rain. We left our tents pitched as we were planning to camp in the same place that night, so it was a very lazy day. I mostly meandered among the narrow, shallow channels at displacement speed. There is no rush hour in this area. The tree-lined shores were in complete contrast to the rugged cliffs and coasts of Mull, but just as interesting in their own way. We arrived back at camp in time for lunch, and after we ate, the sky brightened, so we took a walk on the wild side to see what we could see. The bluebells are magnificent at this time of year, and so are the green colours in the old oak forests. We followed an old drove road that passed near where we were camping. This old Land Rover had been here for a while. Its toolkit was spread across the passenger seat, so I presume it had broken down. The views over Loch Nandromnabuie and Loch Soonert started to open up as we slogged our way up the hill. Well, I did, but Jennifer managed it no problem. The effort was well worth it though, as the views over the Morvern and Ardnamurchan Peninsula were stunning. And by the time we get back to camp, cooked our dinners and relaxed, it was time for bed. Another day was done as we watched the setting sun. My brother texts the forecast for the following day. Light force 3 winds dropping to force 2 in the afternoon. Perfect for going back home down the Sound of Mull. And after 4 days at sea, covering just short of 200 miles, we arrived safely back at Tidal. Another adventure done. My sincere thanks to Jennifer for her great company in the trip. Thanks for watching.